Well, hello, everyone. Hello. Um, my name is Sue Shakespeare, and I'm ASIFA-Hollywood's president-elect. Today, I have the distinct honor of introducing Ron Clements and John Musker, the legendary Disney directors who throughout the years have directed animated features such as The Great Mouse Detective, The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Hercules, Treasure Planet, The Princess and the Frog, and Moana. They have brought so much magic and joy to the world through their creative wizardry. And today we're going to get a peek into the creative process of these amazing minds. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ron Clements and John Musker.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello.
Are we on? Hello, I think we're on. Sorry for the delay. We had some technical. Yeah, that's Ron over there on the screen there. I'm John. I'm the other half. I'm the younger of the two of us. I know it's hard to believe given my wizened appearance, but I'm 6 months younger than Ron. But we're both really old guys. Yeah.
We were both born the same year, 1953, a good year.
Yeah, good year, yes. And we're here to talk about, and it's so great to be sharing this with Annecy, albeit a virtual version of Annecy. Both Ron and I have spent time there and have loved the time we spent at that festival. It's an amazing town, and the medieval city there, and the lake, and the raclette, and all of that stuff, and the paper airplanes.
We very much hope to come back because we had such a great time at Annecy. But this is what we're doing instead. So this should be fun.
Yeah. So Ron, we're going to talk a whole range of things. We're going to talk a little bit about our backgrounds. We're going to talk about our process. We're going to talk about the future of animation. We're going to talk about all sorts of things. And I think, Ron, my script is a little sketchy here, but why don't you start talking about your background, and then I will follow you.
Okay, I'll start because I actually went to Disney a little ahead of John. But in terms of how I got started, I am from the Midwest in the United States, in a small city called Sioux City, Iowa, in the Midwest. And growing up, I was a big animation fan. I loved cartoons. I loved to draw cartoon characters. I loved the Disney animated features. I think the first one I saw was Cinderella when I was 3 years old. But the big event for me was when I was 9 years old and I saw a reissue of the Disney film Pinocchio. And for whatever reason, hard to explain, that film just blew me away. I became obsessed with that film. I went to see it again and again before it left. It played for 2 weeks in Sioux City, then it was gone for 7 years. And I did many, many drawings of the characters. I actually have a couple of those that I'm going to show you. I was 9 years old. This is can
you see your monitor?
Yeah, you got it. I can't see my monitor. I was still working in crayon at this point. You can see it.
He still works in crayon.
Yes, I still do. But I tried. I really pressed really hard on the crayon. You could see because I was trying to get that look. It wasn't easy. Here's another one that I did, and I actually did many drawings like this, and some without coloring, without crayon. But it was like the best movie I'd ever seen, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. And at that time, I thought, I want to be involved with something like this. I want to work in animation somehow. That's when I sort of decided. I went to the Sioux City Public Library to find out anything I could about animation. I couldn't find much, but I did find this book, The Art of Animation by Bob Thomas. This was like the Bible for all of us at that time. It's the greatest book. It actually goes through the making of Sleeping Beauty, but it talks about the other films too. And it really goes through the entire process of how animated films were made. And I got so inspired. I checked that out of the library, I think, over and over and over again. But this is not my library book. This is, in fact, my own copy that I bought later. I did not steal it. Anyway, after this, when I was in 8th grade, I got a little Super 8 camera, and I made little Super 8 films, little Super 8 animated films. And when I was 15 years old, I actually got a job at a local TV station to do graphic art and all kinds of TV artwork. And I showed them the little Super 8 films I made. And we actually thought we could actually make local commercials. So we made some local TV commercials. The same time, I was graduating from high school now, and I didn't know, I knew I wanted to pursue animation. At that time, there were very few schools that taught animation. CalArts character animation program had not started yet. I did visit New York, the School of Visual Arts in New York, which did have an animation program there that seemed pretty good, but I chickened out, and I was afraid to move to New York. I was afraid I wouldn't survive. But at the same time, I had this idea of wanting to make my own film, and I talked to people at the TV station into letting me make my own personal film, and I made a little 15-minute animated film about Sherlock Holmes called Shades of Sherlock Holmes. I have a cell. This is an actual production cell setup. You can see there's the characters, there's the painted background, just like old-time animation. And that film actually got a certain amount of notoriety, and it led to me going to Los Angeles because an executive, it was shown around Iowa, and an executive from LA saw the film. He knew some people at Hanna-Barbera, and I got contacts there. So I left Sioux City, I moved to Hanna-Barbera, worked there as an in-betweener, wanted to get into Disney. I kept calling Disney. I kept calling the personnel department. They said they weren't hiring people, but little did I know until I saw an article in a magazine that they actually had a talent development program that they had started in the early 1970s. They were actually looking for new talent because after the success of Jungle Book, they felt if they were going to continue animation, which was a question for a while, they were going to have to bring in new people, and they were looking for people about my age. I was 20 at the time. And so I got into an animation training program where you work for 4 weeks to do a personal test. At the end of that time, the older animators would look at your personal test. If they thought you had potential, you went another 4 weeks working with Eric Larson, who was in charge of the training program. And I made it through the first 4 weeks just barely. I made it through the second 4 weeks, and I was hired permanently at Disney, and that's basically how I got into Disney.
My path was very similar in some ways to Ron, and certainly my background being the same age. I always drew as a kid, I did cartoons and things like that. I saw some of those same films. So the ones that sort of hit me in my wheelhouse when I was 5 or 6 years old, I saw Sleeping Beauty in the theater on its original release, and saw Pinocchio, saw 101 Dalmatians and Sword in the Stone. Those were all sort of released when I was, from whatever, 6 to 10. And they were very vivid to me. In some ways, they seem more vivid to me than live action films that I saw at the time. So I was hooked. I read that same book from the library, the Bob Thomas book. And then but I was interested in a bunch of different kinds of cartooning. I did cartoons for the school paper, all that kind of stuff. I started going to the Chicago Film Festival, which had some animation programs, a big international festival. They had a show one year when I was in high school of all the Zagreb animation from Yugoslavia. So I went and I must have seen 80 different Zagreb cartoons, and I loved all those. And then the following year, I think it was, Richard Williams came and spoke at the Chicago Film Festival, and he was showing his version of The Christmas Carol. And he spoke very powerfully about animation as an art form, and he showed his shorts in addition to that. And people in the audience were raising their hands and saying, "Will you please hire me?" And I felt that way too, even though I was sort of just had started college at that point. And in fact, in college, I majored in English literature because I thought drawing was kind of self-taught and I wanted to sort of read the great books. But while at college, Chuck Jones came to speak at our school to an animation conference they had. Again, a very powerful influence on me, showed his films, was very funny, and he made it seem like you could be 60 years old, as Chuck was at that time, or in his early 60s, and he felt like he was still learning. And so I thought, as a 20-year-old hearing that, I thought, well, that seems like an interesting career, to be able to do something when you're 60 that you still feel like you're learning. At that time, the Christopher Finch book, The Art of Walt Disney, came out, and they talked about this training program. So I wrote away to Disney to find out about it. They said, we need a portfolio of animal drawings. And of course, I don't know if there are some Irish people in the audience, and I'm stereotyping Irish, but my insistence is that most Irish people have every allergy known to mankind, which I did too. So we never had any mammals around the house other than my fellow family members. So when I was going to try and draw a dog or a cat even, there were none to draw. So I went to the zoo, and I lived in Chicago in a very cold place. It was wintertime. So I was trying to draw the darn monkeys in their cage, and I was freezing and the monkeys was freezing, and it wasn't working. so I had a brainwave, and I went to the Field Museum of Natural History where they had dioramas of animals. And I went there, and it was 70 degrees inside. I'm sorry, it's Fahrenheit. I can't tell you the Celsius. I drew the animals. I sent away the portfolio. And then I got rejected by Disney. They rejected me. And they said, of all things, that my animal drawings were stiff. I maintain they were stiff when I saw them, and that's the way I drew them. But so I got rejected, and I was, what do I do? And I sent a portfolio to Marvel Comics, got rejected by them. And it was one after another. And then Disney, fortunately, sent me another letter and said, well, maybe you want to send your portfolio to CalArts. They're just beginning a character animation program. They're taught by Disney veterans. You might want to look into that. And I thought, I will look into that. I sent them the same portfolio, and I got accepted there. And so I wound up going there and studying animation for 2 years. And my classmates there, it was the first year of the program, but my classmates included John Lasseter and Brad Bird and Henry Selick and Nancy Beeman and Daryl Van Sitters, and Tim Burton was a year behind me in school. And so it was a very formative thing. We really learned as much from each other as we did from the instructors. Ultimately, after 2 years at CalArts, I was hired by Disney. I started at Disney the week that Star Wars came out. Actually, Disney had sent representatives to CalArts to look at the student work, and they saw my student work and they liked it, and they invited me to come work there, not realizing that they had rejected me, 2 years before that. But I tried not to correct their misapprehension. So that's how I got there. And then we began to work, as I did and Ron did, with mentors at the Disney studio. And I think that's a big part of our thing. I don't know if Ron wants to talk about his mentorship. Or you want me to start
about Eric, because I worked with Eric Larson, and that was one of my first great mentors. But why don't you talk about Eric?
I'll talk about Eric. Okay, and then Ron will talk about Frank. Eric Larson was my animation mentor and really was the person who taught me it. He was in charge of the training program. He was a very avuncular guy. I have a caricature I did. I can hold this up here of me and Eric Larson back at the studio back in the 70s there, the later 70s. Eric was a wonderful animator. He had animated Figaro the cat in Pinocchio, and he had animated Sasha the little bird in Peter and the Wolf, and he was sort of an animal expert and puppies in the 101 Dalmatians. But his big thing in some ways was the saucy show dog Peg in Lady and the Tramp. And it was a very out of character thing because Eric was a very understated, genteel, gentlemanly sort of fellow. And here he's doing this sort of slightly borderline racy show dog, and he did an amazing job. Anyway, he was our mentor. We would do bits of test animation, design our own characters, draw that, all drawn on paper. And Eric would take our scenes and he would put the piece of paper down, our drawing, and put a piece of paper over it. And he would draw over it, and not necessarily trying to make it look like the character, but he would show in simple ways how you could make much more strong statements. He talked about arcs, and he talked about silhouettes, and he talked about the change of shape, and he talked about acting and performance. All of these things really master to apprentice right there. And it was such a powerful thing. And he really taught an entire generation of animators. Now, Ron had a experience with Eric, but then he went on to work with Frank.
Right. I loved working with Eric. He's such a brilliant teacher. And after I made it through the training program, I working with Eric, I did a longer sort of personal test with the character Cruella de Vil, and Eric helped me a lot with that test. And the studio liked that test very much, and Frank Thomas liked it very much. Pardon me?
I was saying you were legendary because of that test. It was like, did you see that Cruella test that Ron Clements did? Whoa! And yes, it brought him to Frank Thomas' attention.
Yeah, and Frank actually asked me to work with him at that point as an animation trainee. And Frank, as with Eric, one of the legendary 9 old men, he did the scene in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs where the dwarfs sort of mourned the death of Snow White, which was actually the first time that audiences actually shed tears in an animated film. People knew that they could make you laugh, but that was the first time people knew that films could make you cry. He also did really brilliant animation on Pinocchio and Bambi and Captain Hook. And one of his great memorable scenes was the spaghetti scene in Lady and the Tramp. And Frank was his emphasis was on acting, strong acting, and character relationships. In fact, he was such a strong actor. Chuck Jones once called Frank the Laurence Olivier of animators. Brilliant man. I worked with him for 2 years doing animation for The Rescuers, the film The Rescuers, And I would do scenes, take them to him. He would go over them, show me how to make them better. At a certain point, I became an animator on my own, but still checked in with him. Always the emphasis with Frank was on getting into the character, getting to know the character, and particularly what that character is thinking. When people talk about showing the character thinking, I think when you're first into animation, you think, what does that mean? And does it mean that we show characters always sort of pondering? But it's actually just getting inside the head of your character and knowing what they're thinking at all times, and conveying that, because the dialogue or whatever doesn't necessarily put that over. A lot of it is the eyes. So much is conveyed through the eyes of the characters. And the spaghetti sequence is a great example of that. That the movement is two dogs eating spaghetti, but you watch that carefully, and it's two dogs falling in love. And it's so great the way Frank was able to convey that, and it's by showing what the characters are thinking, and knowing what that is, and trying to get the audience to know what it is. The other thing Frank emphasized that was so important was exploring the possibilities. That is, if you get a scene of animation and you think, I know how I want to do that, don't just go with your first impulse. He said, actually force yourself to come up with 5 different ideas of how to animate the scene, and then pick the best one. And that applies, I think, not only to animation, but it applies to everything that we do in animation, to explore the possibilities, to really feel like you've checked everything out as much as you can in terms of entertainment, and that really, I think, it elevates kind of everything that you do. Take it, John.
We wanted to talk a little bit now about what we look for in a story when we're trying to develop these films. Obviously, when we were doing these things, we had to pitch our ideas to various people, whether or not it would be a Jeffrey Katzenberg or a Ed Catmull and John Lasseter. But Ron and I would develop ideas, to things that would interest us. Certainly, that was the first thing. Is it had to be something that we personally connected to in some fashion, that we had some aspect of it that we responded to on an emotional level, that we just liked. We weren't trying to make movies for another audience. We were the audience. So we were trying to find things that appealed to us. And when we looked at things, we usually said, any story that we looked at, what is a way that we can use animation to tell that story that exploits the fact that it's animation, that we tell it in a way that wouldn't be done in live action, or couldn't be done on the stage, or even in a novel or something like that. It really exploits animation. Now that rule, as it were, it has become a little blurrier or harder to define as live action has evolved and moved so much closer to animation with the introduction of digital technologies into live action filming, with the sets and even with the characters and all that. But so, for example, even like doing a movie like Little Mermaid, I know they're going to try and do a live action film of it, and I wish them well with that. But just even the convention of people speaking and singing underwater, I mean, it's a convention and it's a stylization that I think is easy to accept in a hand-drawn film, and it'll be maybe a little bit of a challenge in a live action film. Not impossible, but a little bit tricky. When we did Aladdin, we built the film around the genie, and he was a shapeshifter. He morphed, and that's certainly one of the definitions of animation, is the change of shape and the change of form. And that led us to even say, who's the ultimate of that? And of course, we thought of Robin Williams being the ultimate sort of vocal shapeshifter. And we thought, and in a way, I feel like our film of Aladdin uses Robin in a way that almost no live action film was able to, that we were able to sort of tap into the essence of Robin. And that's part of the magic of animation. We also looked, when we were developing stories, at how music could help tell the story. What about a certain story, what musical style might it demand? And we like music. Ron and I grew up as fans of musicals. We liked classic Hollywood musicals, and we liked the stylization of music telling the story, compressing emotion, compressing storytelling beats, and elevating those things, and just the entertainment value of that. That wasn't a hard sell. Some of the other younger directors, I would say, maybe the idea of doing songs or characters breaking into songs seemed foreign to them. For us, it seemed very natural. And lastly, I might say just these movies involve the creation of worlds. So when we're looking at stories, we're trying to think, what is a world that you would like to spend an hour and a half in? What is a unique window we can give into that world? And Joe Hale, the producer of Black Cauldron, once said he thought of the movies that we make that they're like tree houses. And if I could pan my computer over there, I could show you. There's a tree house in my backyard that I built for my kids. And I like his analogy, because I feel like these movies are kind of like tree houses, in that they're fun like tree houses are. You get to see the world from another point of view. You go up in a tree house and you're looking at your own house, your backyard, from a different perspective. and there's a sense of adventure about it. Of you're doing something, you're sort of stepping into a different world. And for all those reasons, I like his analogy that films are like tree houses. Ron, take it away.
Yeah, and yeah, all those things. I mean, a story idea doesn't necessarily have all those things to begin with, but we look for the potential. There's the potential to find this and to find entertainment and to find great personalities. I think Snow White is the perfect example of the Disney idea. When Walt took Snow White, that the dwarves in the original fairy tale didn't have personalities, but Walt felt it was very important that each one of those individual dwarves had personalities that came through strongly and relationships. And we do the same thing. We always approach it that way. We want to find strong characters and strong relationships, and we have different ways of doing that. How do you create a powerful character? Sometimes we'll base a personality on somebody we know, somebody even at work. There's actually aspects of Glenn Keane, the brilliant animator who animated Ariel, that actually are in Ariel. There are qualities she has that I think we thought of Glenn, because he jumps into things and he's bold, and sometimes he could get into situations. A perfect example. When he was visiting his hometown of Minneapolis, he met a girl in a line at a movie theater named Linda. Pardon me?
He's from Scottsdale, Arizona. Go ahead.
Right, but he was in Minneapolis visiting, and this girl was with another guy, but he immediately, it was like love at first sight, just like Ariel. He felt like, this is the girl for me. He pursued her. He looked her down. He tracked her down. They eventually got married. They're still married to this day. That's Glenn. That's very similar to Ariel's personality. There's a few villains that we based on some of our bosses. We also, as John said, sometimes we'll look for an actual actor that we feel like expresses, and Robin Williams is the best example of that. We wrote the genie with Robin Williams in mind. We felt he was the only actor that could possibly play that character. Thank God we were able to get him to do it. We also look even at older movies. We're big fans of screwball comedies. The films of Frank Capra, Preston Sturges. The character of Meg in Hercules is actually based on Barbara Stanwyck, the legendary actress Barbara Stanwyck, with her kind of saucy femme fatale personality, particularly the Lady Eve. And we also draw from our research. When we visited New Orleans at Research for Princess and the Frog, we met this Cajun tour guide who took us through the bayou, and he was missing a few teeth, and he had a really colorful accent, and his name was Reggie, and we actually based the character of Ray in Princess and the Frog on that character. So you can find characters anywhere you look, but I think it's really important that the audience connect to those characters, because we really have to create them from scratch. John?
Yeah, and so we wanted to talk a little bit about our process, our collaborative process in both writing and directing. I think Ron is going to start by talking about the writing process and how we work together on that. Ron, can you hear me?
Yeah, we both did storyboards, and we both did directing on The Great Mouse Detective. But really, we worked on different sequences, and I would say our collaboration really began with The Little Mermaid. And it began with the script of The Little Mermaid. And I think the process we used on The Little Mermaid is really the same process we kind of use pretty much on all the films after that. And we start exploring the story, investigating the story. We kick around a lot of ideas. We put a lot of index cards on storyboards. We try to find the beats, and we collaborate a lot in that process. And once we feel the story is pretty solid, and we get an okay, then we move into treatments or a script. And the way we've always worked with scripts has sort of remained the same. John actually starts the process. John, he always starts, and John likes to, I would say, kind of improvise on paper. He will fill notepads with writing just tons and tons of pages. He'll write scenes, he'll write ideas for entertainment, he'll write ideas for dialogue, multiple different alternate dialogues. It really is what it talked about earlier with the exploration. He explores tons of ideas and comes up with, it's sort of raw material, but it's really great material. And as he writes that, he turns it over to me. I sort of work on the word processor, and I start actually trying to turn that into a finished script. And I will sometimes, if I'll take just what John wrote and just use it verbatim if I think it's good. A lot of times I'll rewrite it or change things. Sometimes I'll just not go with it and write the scene differently. But basically I don't show him anything until I come up with a completed script that I feel relatively happy with, and I turn that over to John. And it's almost like, because I don't think John even rereads anything he writes. So when he reads it, it almost feels like a brand new script, and he doesn't really even know what came from where. And that gives him a kind of a fresh view of it. And then he'll give me notes. He'll give me pages of notes, and we'll go back and forth at that point and then rewrite the script till we're both happy with it and then turn it in.
And in a way that the collaborative writing process then helps when we get into the directing thing. And now different teams of directors divvy up the work sort of differently. Both Ron and I came up at Disney when there was a system of sort of sequence directors. And I would say the classic Disney films generally had sequence directors. They had Walt as a very strong producer, but then they would have multiple directors. So that did not seem foreign to us, the idea that we might have two directors. Actually, Jeffrey Katzenberg and the live action people in charge in the 80s were thrown by the idea of two directors. And initially they resisted, but they came to embrace that. But so we would co-direct the film. The film would be divided into sequences. And through most of the films that we made, we would each have our own respective sequences that we would kind of supervise those sequences while collaborating together on many different elements. But and we would divvy up the sequences. It was almost like we each voted on which sequence we would like to do, and we sort of bartered back and forth. And we each wanted to do the songs, and so we would sort of decide, well, if you're going to do that song, I'm going to do this song, and I want to do that song. So we kind of trade back and forth a little bit. I would say not exclusively, but it came to work out where a lot of times I wound up doing some of maybe the comedy and action sequences, and Ron did some of the more dramatic and heartfelt moments, but it wasn't exclusively that. So for example, Ron, although he did Part of Your World and where the grotto was destroyed in Little Mermaid, he directed those sequences. He also did Under the Sea, perhaps the biggest production number in Disney history, and a big comedy number. And conversely, I did The Witch's Song, and I did Les Poissons, and those kind of funny, darker moments, and some of the climactic action. The Storm at Sea, I did that. But I also did the reprise of Part of Your World, which was kind of a dramatic, turning point of the movie. So we both kind of did both. But we worked together in terms of casting the voices for the movie, casting the animators for the movie, looking at character designs, looking at storyboards, art direction ideas, all those things we really looked at together and weighed in on. And our tastes were similar enough that rarely did we go totally opposite directions. So it might be shaded one way or the other, but we were pretty much in sync most of the time. And when we weren't, there was usually a producer standing by who could weigh in and kind of resolve differences of opinion. And one of the things, of course, people say, how did you collaborate all those years? One of the ways that I coped with the close bond that we had was through caricature. I do caricatures, and of course, caricature is a part of Disney tradition, and I have been caricatured many times. I have a few of them here. I'm going to show you. I just got this not too long ago. It's all counterintuitive. I should be holding it here. This is Brad Bird did this sculpture of me at CalArts, and he gave it to me when I retired. I forgot he had done it. And here's good old Nathan Engelhart did this wonderful head of me. I don't know how they can find things to caricature with me, but they do. It's crazy. And this is a really scary one. This is Ryan Tottle, a modeler, did this of me. Isn't that lovely? Yes. Okay, beautiful. My children are still frightened by that. I am. But Kathy Zielinski may have done the ultimate ones. She did this funny little punching doll here that I was trying to get work last night. It kind of can put the little hands punch and everything. I had done a caricature of Kathy that she hadn't really liked, so she did that. But the pièce de résistance of caricatures of me, in some ways, is this head that Kathy did here. Yes, this is Kathy Zielinski's work here, and she did this. I did a caricature. Can you? Here I am. Yes. This is Kathy's fine work. A taxidermist. But now I did, of course, do a million caricatures of Ron Clements because that was part of my coping mechanism. So I have a few of those here, coincidentally enough, and I just want to show a couple. But of course, I did Ron as Toulouse-Lautrec here. Let's see, there's Ron with Nicole Kidman. There's another story later, but I won't go into that with Ron and Nicole. One day, Ron wore a shirt to work that looked like a legal pad, so I drew him with his line of fashion that was, the legalese outfit with legal paper. Ron was obsessed with watching Breaking Bad for a few years, and he has Basset Hounds, so I did Ron as the star of his own series, Breaking Bassets. Let's see, Breaking Bassets. It's like Breaking Bad. Here, I go further back. Yes,
I have had many Basset Hounds over the years.
So Ron is a Basset fan, so he had a Basset rescue ranch. He's totally devoted to them. We had a big contretemps with the studio because the studio's switching over. Everybody had been drinking Arrowhead water, and they said, no, or had been drinking Evian, and they said, no, it's cheaper for us to get Arrowhead. I'm telling my shorthand version of the story. Ron somehow said, but I like Evian. So they made an exception for Ron and gave him Evian water. So I drew this drawing of Ron as kind of Louis XIV, insisting on his Evian. He disputes this story somewhat, but it's true. And he has a cape full of Basset Hounds there. But the one Ron I also tease about, because he's obsessed with Star Trek. He's a Trekkie. He denies it, but he is. When we were making Treasure Planet, I did this drawing of Ron. He was sending us all to X-Blog for it. So where am I going? It's all backwards on here. But that's Ron at the command of the Enterprise there. We're taking it to X-Blog for it. He really wanted to be Captain Kirk. He really did.
Yeah, John, it's crazy. John gives me a hard time. Because I like Star Trek and I watch Star Trek like that makes me some sort of a geek or a Trekkie. And really, I don't think that's true. I mean, I think it's weirder that John had always claimed that he's never seen an episode of Star Trek. I mean, I just happen to like Star Trek, and it's just really not a big deal. But excuse me.
What you have? Okay.
My technical issues continue. I charged this morning, and I guess it doesn't hold the charge. The whole gag is ruined. But this is actually, I got this. This is an actual Star Trek communicator that you can actually talk to the Enterprise, and they will answer, and they will. You can talk to your Spock. I'm not advertising, but we had this wonderful gag prepared. But this has been a day of slightly things not quite going the way we hoped they would, and it worked this morning. I swear to God.
Yeah. Okay, Ron. Nothing worse than Ron. Yeah. Can you hear me now, Ron? Did that destroy everything? But Ron, if you panned over the camera, you would see a Star Trek pinball machine hanging in his closet. He's got an outfit for both Captain Picard and Captain Kirk. He's got a painting that was done for TV Guide of Star Trek, but he's not a Trekkie. He's not a Trekkie. No way is he a Trekkie. We wanted, yeah, no, and even the gag, he can't get the gag to work on it. Okay, so we want to talk for just a couple minutes about music. Music being an important part of our films. Howard Ashman was a mentor for us. When we worked on Little Mermaid, we were sort of paired up with Howard Ashman and Alan Menken by the studio. They were wooing Howard. They had seen Little Shop of Horrors, and Jeffrey Katzenberg was a fan of that, and David Geffen had produced that, and David Geffen said, you should really work with this guy, Howard Ashman. They tried to entice him. Meantime, we had seen Little Shop of Horrors on stage at the Westwood Playhouse, loved it, and they said to us, are you interested in working with Howard? They said to Howard, here's a list of ideas at the studio that are in development, one of which was The Little Mermaid. And Howard said, that's the one I would like to work on. I'm a huge Hans Christian Andersen fan. So they paired us up with Howard. We went to New York to meet with Howard. Howard pitched us the idea of one of the very first things when we talked to him. He said, are you thinking this movie is going to be strictly set in Denmark? Because I have this idea that I want the music, because of the seaside motif of, mermaids and water, that there's a way of contemporizing the music by having it have calypso and reggae elements in it. And we said, yeah, we think of this. We were stunned at first. So he said, I think, your crab character, who's kind of a stuffed shirt British guy, could actually be a Rastafarian. And we had to think for about 30 seconds, but we very quickly said, we're totally open to that idea. We think of this as a fairy tale world. It's not strictly Denmark in the, the 1700s. Although I do understand that there was a big calypso movement in Denmark around 1750 that we tapped into. But anyway, Howard, we wrote a treatment. Howard spotted songs in our treatment. He said, I think you could put a song here and put a song there. We had a few ideas. Howard had many others. And he came on board, and he really changed, the future of the Disney studio, changed our lives. He was very a brilliant writer. And his big thing and our thing, too, was obviously that music had to advance the story. We felt like any song that was in the movie had to advance either plot or character or both. And that if you could take the song and take it out of the movie and you could still understand the story, that was a problem. That meant that there was something, the story was stopping during the song. We didn't want that to happen. That was one of Howard's big lessons. And then Ron can talk about some of the other musicians we've worked with. We worked with many greats.
Well, obviously Howard, and then Alan Menken, who we continue to work on Aladdin. Howard passed away during the making of Aladdin, so Alan continued with Tim Rice on that film, and each film, I think, has its different approach. Aladdin is kind of, I mean, it's a very loose comical approach that Howard brought to that actually helped the tone of the film. In Hercules, it was actually John Musker's idea to go with gospel for that movie, and we felt gospel fits because somehow it's bigger than life and celebrating, in this case, Greek mythology. So the Muses idea actually came from John, and that brought so much to that. Then in the more later musicals we did, I think also, I mean, John's very oriented to music on The Princess and the Frog. I believe it was John Musker's idea to go with Randy Newman. A lot of people think it was John Lasseter's idea, but really John did, and I totally agree, because I'm a big fan of Randy Newman, because we knew that he had spent a lot of time in his youth growing up in New Orleans, and he was very familiar with the distinctive kind of music of that world, with the Zydeco and the gospel and the blues and that's just that New Orleans vibe. And it was great working with Randy. Once again, a totally different experience. Very great. He's very funny, great sense of humor, and brought a lot to the film. And then there was Moana, our most recent musical. And I think our approach on Moana when we started was we wanted to do kind of a Lion King template, where on Lion King there were kind of three key people who did the music of the Lion King. There was certainly Elton John, who did the pop music songs, but then there was Le Bohème, who really brought the influence, the African cultural influence, into the film, which was so important. And then a guy named Mark Mancina, who was part of the glue, along with Hans Zimmer, who brought all that together with the songs and fused it and made it work. And the first person we brought onto Moana was actually Mark Mancina, and because we felt he could do the same thing and kind of really he's very into world music and very, very collaborative. And then we definitely wanted someone from the islands who could really bring that definite connection to the roots of the music of the islands. And our producer, Ozna Ashur, had a great find with Opatai Fawai, who with his family is part of a group called Tavaka, who were very, very popular in the South Pacific, and their songs really kind of represent very strong connection to the Polynesian and culture. But we still felt we needed someone from the world of theater. So this was around the time Frozen came out. We flew to New York, and we met the cream of the crop of the New York theater world. Just about everybody that we talked to there really wanted to be involved with the movie. And in the course of our interviews, we met this one guy, Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was very passionate and eager, and we liked him a lot. And we had seen In the Heights, and we really liked In the Heights. And he felt of all these different people, like he could be the guy. And he was very open to collaboration. Some of the other people we talked to were not. And so as we met him in New York, he mentioned offhandedly, really, toward the end of our interview, that he was involved with another project, a sort of hip-hop rap version of the story of our founding fathers, focusing on Alexander Hamilton. And our reaction at the time, I would have to say, was, okay, that sounds interesting. And we didn't really think it would have too much impact on our movie until about a year later. Hamilton opened, the first in public theater, was a phenomenon, the biggest phenomenon in the history of theater for years and years, moved to Broadway, and it became this huge deal. But at the same time, it was great working with Lin, even though most of the time we had to collaborate with him in New York and us in LA. A lot of times we met with him just before he was about to go on stage because of the time difference. And then he would, at meetings, he had to take pauses and things.
Ron, did I lose you?
To win the... Pardon me?
I lost you for a second, but maybe they didn't. You froze for a minute. Keep going.
Okay,
keep
yeah,
going.
you did earlier. Well, hopefully we're there. At any rate, working with Lynn was a great experience, and it was kind of going full circle because Lynn is a huge fan of Howard Ashman and Alan Menken, and growing up, he was influenced by Little Mermaid particularly. In fact, his first son is named Sebastian. In fact, who was born during the making of the movie. So there's that's a big part of now that as we getting into our years. I was 20 years old when I worked with Frank Thomas, and he was 62. I'm now much older, somewhat older than Frank was, and it's cool to see things coming full circle now, and people who were now, just like I was influenced by Pinocchio, people who were influenced by the films that we saw, have moved into the industry, and it's just a really cool thing.
Yeah, Ron's talking about Moana. We did want to talk for just a bit, and we're about to do a question and answer, but we'll talk just for a minute or two here about CG versus 2D. We love hand-drawn, but CG is a very powerful thing too. We like stop motion too. I mean, we like really all forms of animation. When we were doing Moana, it was a question how we were going to do it. We considered that it might be some kind of hybrid a la Paperman, although ultimately we went with it being a CG film. And in part, I felt like it was legitimized in some ways. When we were in the islands, I talked to an artist there in Samoa, and I said, are there any island illustrators you could point to us that we could use as points of departure as we're getting going? And he said, no, well, we have a sculpture tradition here, but we don't really have a drawn tradition here particularly. So the idea of sculpture sort of pushes things towards CG. The people's faces we saw on the islands, these beautiful people of the islands, Tahiti and Samoa and Fiji, they seemed like they were walking sculptures. They had beautiful sculptural faces and with planes and all that. And that sort of pointed us toward CG a bit. And of course, now having done the film, and I think John last year certainly was a strong proponent of doing CG on that particular film, I'm glad that we did use CG because of what we could do with the water, with the texture. I mean, we really wanted the ocean to be a character in the movie. We were able to bring it to life using, just as we said earlier, with stories. What can we find in the story that makes it, special for animation, to tell it in animation? Likewise, what can we use in CG technology that exploits what CG does well? And the water was certainly a case in point, as were the textures of these outfits and like our moving volcano villainous Tekka. They were realized in ways in CG that we couldn't otherwise do. We did discover the process was a little hard to figure out because it's a different pipeline. 2D seemed very linear to us. You start with, a storyboard and you go to a layout and animation and cleanup and backgrounds. CG was more iterative and more of a zigzag course, and we had to kind of figure it out. We had to have people steering us through because they would show us things in dailies, and we would start critiquing what we were looking at. We'd say, okay, well, now the sky in this shot, and they said, no, the sky is a placeholder. Forget about that. Don't worry about the sky. We just threw that in there. And we'd say, okay. But now the trees over on the left, no, the trees, we put those in there. We're working on the trees. They're not finished yet. Don't worry about the trees. So then we would think, I think we have the hang of this, and we'd say, so we should ignore those rocks down there in the foreground. And then they would say, well, no, those are the real rocks. You better pay attention to those. We had no idea without someone telling us what was what we were looking at. So it went that way throughout production, but it was dazzling when we would see the shots come together in the lighting department, see all the different elements realized, and our jaws would drop literally every day of making that movie, I think. And the results on the screen, we couldn't have been happier with. It was so enveloping. And of course, a movie about the ocean being immersive, that's a good thing. And Ron, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
I was just on that movie. There was a certain element comparing hand-drawn with CG of delayed gratification, that it took a while because so much has to be built ahead of time. We had to see things at so many different stages that it really was in the last few months when as John said, we were just blown away by every stage, how it just looked more and more incredible. At the same time, we are still, I think, big fans of hand-drawn animation. We love hand-drawn animation. I think it has its place. There's a certain charm and distinctiveness about it that is different than any other kind of animation. So we hope that has a good future. I think it's encouraging. There are so many young people nowadays who really love hand-drawn and want to continue it, and so I love CG. I think and I think in certain ways, like you say, there there are things unmatched, and it will continue to develop. But hopefully, hand drawn will have a really strong future as well.
Yeah, just overall in terms of the future, I know Frank is going to jump in. We're just going to say a minute and a half about the future of animation, which is just that I think it's bright. I think, I don't know who's in our audience today, if there are students, if there are professionals, if it's a mixed bag, it probably is. But I think, the box office success of animation around the world is amazing. Half the movies in the top 10 every year now seem like they're animated features. The size of the gaming industry, which is huge and demanding of animation, the streaming services now that they're distributing animation more and more, that's a good thing. And I just read in Variety the other day that Peter Jackson, down in at Weta, they're starting a digital animation division, and I think that bodes well. Obviously, even in this pandemic, the one form of production that's proceeding is animated production. So for all of those young people out there, I would still recommend pursuing a career. If you're interested in this, I would say, try and learn to draw if you can, even if you're in CG, because it's a good skill. But I think the future looks good. And with that, Ron, if you want to add anything, and we'll turn it over to Frank for Q&A.
I mean, I may try. I just got a warning coming up. I don't know, that says I may be impacted by some technical thing that's happening. Am I still coming through?
You still look fine. Pretend you didn't see that.
Okay.
Ignore that.
Take it.
I'm Frank Gladstone. I'm the executive director of ASIFA-Hollywood. It's my pleasure to moderate the Q&A, and there's been a lot of questions coming in. We will not get to all of them by any stretch, but we'll start. And because I get to go on here and have enjoyed and had quite a lot of laughs, I've had my camera and microphone muted, but I've been watching, and I've had a bunch of good laughs from you guys, which is a good thing. I'm going to ask the first question. I'm going to take you back just a little bit to when you guys were at Disney before you became directors. I think you were both there during Fox and Hound, right?
Yes.
So there was a great migration during Fox and Hound, I believe, and a whole bunch of people that are still your pals left to go with Don.
Right.
How did that affect the studio at the time and you guys?
Well, it was first.
John will talk.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to talk about Don Bluth a little bit in terms of when I started before CalArts. The group that I started with, the few people that were there before me, Don Bluth, Gary Goldman, John Pomeroy, Andy Gaskell was there just before me. Glenn came shortly after. So I knew those guys pretty well. Don was the director on Pete's Dragon. I would say there were philosophical differences, and when the CalArts people came, this new wave that sort of came, that Don was very high on at first. He was like, these guys, they're super talented, but I would say, take it, John, in terms of,
well, we were
take it from there.
We were out of sync creatively with Don, and we had a weird thing where we were working on the small one, a Christmas featurette that was going to be directed by Eric Larson, and he was sort of deposed, and Don Bluth was suddenly doing it, and this avuncular Eric Larson was gone, and Don was there, and it sort of set things off on a wrong foot there. Anyway, I'd say we were very collaborative at CalArts, and in a way, everybody was like directing their own film, and we really liked to have input, and I think Don really felt like you had to earn the right to critique the movies, and we felt like, no, just say what you think. If you think it could be better, offer ideas, and I would say that shaped Ron and I's directing style. We were very collaborative. I would say that Don perhaps was less so. So I think he really wanted to go to a situation where he had total control. So he left the studio to really start his own, which was the right move for him, I think, absolutely. He wanted to control his own fate. It did help us, I would say. Well, the studio was alarmed that, suddenly a dozen people were gone. But for some of us who had conflicts with Don Bluth, it actually was a bit of a fresh air in some ways that we were able then to reshape the films according to our tastes and that sort of thing. So short term, the studio is worried, but long term, I would say we felt like we could make films that more accurately reflected our sensibilities in the new era. And certainly, even as Jeffrey and Michael came in and went even further in that direction, that they were from a whole new world of live action. And but they responded to story ideas, and I'd say Ron and I kind of flourished under the Jeffrey and Michael regime there.
Yeah, I remember that. That's about the time I came over to learn training. This first question, from the audience is from some new guy named Tom Moore. I don't exactly know where he's from. You might have heard of him before.
Question in Gaelic? Is it in Gaelic? I don't speak Gaelic.
Yeah, it is in Gaelic, but I've translated it during the time you were on, and it says it talks about collaborating, and you've talked a lot about that. But he said, "I'm just done co-directing with an old friend too, and it's an intense experience. What keeps you guys from doing it all these years? Thanks, Tom Moore."
Ron,
you
want to take
from?
I think
from
what has enabled us not to kill each other over 40 years. That's
it's come close. It's come close, but we've avoided that.
Yeah. I would say in our case, we had enough of the same sensibilities that it helped us. And then the different strengths, because Ron, like in story, which Ron didn't get into so much, but he alluded to, but Ron is so powerful in story structure, and much more so than I am, that's one of his superpowers. I, on the other hand, I'm willing to entertain all sorts of, improvisatory ideas and don't just hang on to this. So you have kind of the bulldog that's trying to hold on to the story, and then the person that's kind of loosey-goosey, and so it's a marriage, and there's different. So it's the sum is greater than the parts. I think the people that would work with us would say that that's the way it tended to work. That we sort of were additive rather than subtractive, and it's lucky it didn't work out that way, because it doesn't always. Sometimes these marriages are imposed. They stick a director with another director, and they don't always gel, and it doesn't work so well. But in our case, as I always say, this marriage was self-inflicted. It was our choice to work together.
Well, if you could let me get a word in here, I just wanted to say that I think that part of it, is that we've always felt like we were making the same movie, and that we were, even if we had different ideas, that the key of it that we we might have different ways of wanting to approach things or do things, but very rarely did I think ever feel like he wants to make a different movie than I want to make, or vice versa, and I think that really helps. If I think it would be much more difficult if we're both roughly the same age, we're both from the Midwest, and we were both editorial cartoonists for our school newspapers. We have we watch the same TV shows, we read the same comic books, but we have somewhat different sensibilities.
And I would say we had these kind of Darwinian arguments sometimes, where basically we would both argue and bicker for a long time, and in theory at least, the person who felt more strongly usually wound up with the last word, just because they felt more strongly about it. So that was our way of resolving some of these things. A strange one, but it's true. Yeah.
It's a marriage. It's a marriage.
It's a marriage.
It has another question from somebody maybe you guys ever heard of, some guy named Bill Croyer. You might have heard of him before.
I'll look up on IMDb. Okay.
And Bill has asked, was there something you learned from Erik Larson that you did not learn in school? And maybe you could add Frank Thomas to that. Something that was
and you should talk about Erik.
Almost like everything I learned about animation, I did not learn in school. I had an animation teacher, Jack Hanna, who had done the Chip and Dale cartoons, and he was more sort of story and gag oriented, not about the techniques of animation at all. So it was Erik that really talked about the change of shape. He talked about positive statements, the value of silhouettes. Those were not, we never had those at CalArts, believe it or not. We sort of taught ourselves at CalArts. So I would say the idea of timing, of caricature, of observation, those were all lessons we learned at the altar, as it were, of Erik Larson. He really taught me pretty much everything I know about animation, because at CalArts, I learned a bit from Brad Bird. I learned a bit from Jerry Reese, some of the other people there. But really, Erik, he really sort of broke it down and showed in a very concrete way how to take something you have and make it stronger and make it communicate more strongly. I think Erik felt very strongly, you have a limited time on the screen, and it's going to, it goes very quickly. So you have to make it indelibly read very, very quickly. Another lesson I learned from Cliff Nordberg, who was a mentor at the studio, that he had gotten from Ward Kimball, was let the audience see the funny picture. Because sometimes I have a tendency, even you go through things so fast, but there's some funny tableau that if you go through it quickly, or you don't allow the audience to see that picture, you'll lose something. So make sure they see the funny picture. Ron.
I would just add that it was interesting. When I started at Disney and when I was working with Eric, I was also taking a union animation class that actually the great Art Babbitt was teaching, who legendary animator, goes back, did the Mushrooms in Fantasia, a goofy animator. But at that time, the way the rest of the industry was, Art's class was really formulaic. It was kind of like, this is how you do a walk, this is how you do a run, this is how you do a take, or this is how you blink. Everything was kind of just very much technique and how to do it. And Eric was totally different. The way Eric taught animation, and you could just tell he was having so much fun when he'd sort of put his piece of paper over and the little guy, and he's doing this, he looks, and he's into it, and he's into that character, and he's into the entertainment and the fun of it, and he made it look like it was really fun, and I think he had fun. And similar with Frank, there again, not so much technique. You kind of just take that a little bit for granted, not movement, but really there again, the importance of acting, the importance of character, the importance of entertainment. I think they were always looking for people to have a sense of entertainment. That's always how they would judge animation in terms of the review board, is if you had, even if you couldn't draw that well, some people can always draw better than others, but if you had a sense of entertainment, a sense of acting, I think that was kind of the most important thing.
One very small technique-y thing that Eric mentioned 2 years ago, which I still always remember, when he was talking about the graphic communication of something. I had a scene, and it wasn't even clear that the character was looking at somebody else. And he said, think of the nose. And of course, I've got a nose that's good for this sort of thing. He said, think of the nose as a pointer. It's a graphic pointer, and it points toward where your eye wants to go. So if someone is talking to someone or whatever, make sure that nose isn't leading you in another direction. It's just as a graphic arrow towards somebody. It's just a simple little thing, but I've used it many times.
Right. I'm going to go with another question. You've talked a little about it in your conversation before, but this is from somebody named Ares Maksar. I hope I'm pronouncing these names correctly. Despite the benefits of modern digital tools, what do you prefer about 90s animated film production versus now, if indeed you do prefer that?
Ron?
Well, I mean, like I say, they are different. And I would say in our experience, sort of the first half of pre-production is very much the same in terms of developing a story, visual exploration, viz dev, writing a script, storyboarding, all of those processes, recording voices. That's very much similar in hand-drawn and CG. And then it gets a little different when you get into production, when you get into layout, when you get into animation and rough animation. Like having experienced both, I would say the thing that, in terms of, if you say 90s animation, which I guess means hand-drawn animation for us, although that certainly with Pixar, digital animation was a very big deal in the 90s. But for us, in terms of hand-drawn animation, I would say there was a little more personal involvement in terms of working with the animators, in terms of drawing
yeah, I would say
there's more of a connection. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, on Moana, we had actual heads of animation. They were great and very talented, Hiram Osman and Amy Smead. But on all our other films, we were the heads of animation. And in fact, there was no title that way. So there was a little bit more of a tiny bit more of a space between us and the animators. That didn't keep us from necessarily doing a drawing or two as we needed to. But I would say that just was part of the nature. It's weird because on the original films, even we didn't even have a head of story on Little Mermaid, as I recall, and that position came around eventually. And I think it's great to have that position. Also, when we first started, the editor was thought of at Disney as a cut and paste person, and they really, we as directors, we picked all of the vocal takes, we timed all the sketches, we did all of that. We really controlled a lot of it. And as the years went on, more and more of those jobs went to other people. The editor did a first pass on picking the takes. The layout people were more involved in the staging, all those things. And I think generally all those things brought more people in, but they enriched the films and made them better to sort of expand that reach out a little bit.
That's a very interesting one. I'm going to move on to another question. This is from Olivia Stark. It says, how does in your experience, how did feature development work at Disney? Where do most of the ideas come from? The directors, the executives, outside pitches?
Yeah.
I'll talk about that a little bit because it's sort of a thing to me. I mean, of course, when we started at Disney, it was a very small little studio. And I think the entire staff was maybe 45 people. Ron Miller, Disney's son-in-law, was in charge of production, and he was kind of Walt. But then when Michael and Jeffrey came, and things changed considerably, and now Disney has grown from that little studio now to this corporate monolith. And I think some people have this idea that the corporate monolith is kind of controlling everything, and we've thought into this, and we've analyzed this, and we've chosen to do this. And I would say, honestly, John could jump in, but from my experience, that's not the case at all. It's still been artists, people. I mean, in our case, Little Mermaid was my idea. I pitched the idea of doing Little Mermaid. Aladdin came from Howard Ashman, and Hercules came from a gong show that was a sort of brainstorming technique where some of the artists would pitch ideas. An animator named Joe Haydar came up with the idea of doing Hercules. And with the approach to the movie, it's always been, and with from Jeffrey Katzenberg to John Lasseter, and there's been a huge emphasis on trying to make the best movie you possibly can and trying to make it as strong and entertaining as you possibly can. But at the same time, there's been, for us, very personal involvement with the movies and with the stories, and feeling, so we've had to sometimes fight a lot for our ideas. But I think in general, we ended up definitely feeling it was our movie, and we felt like it came to what we wanted it to be, even though we were very collaborative when we worked with all these artists, and things would be hugely shaped. But I never felt, and even though merchandising is involved, the other idea is some people think we're just making these films to sell toys. And that, there again, with Little Mermaid, there was hardly any merchandise done at the beginning of that film, because that was not a big part of the process at that point. It became a big part of the process, but it was never a driving thing. It was just ideas that we thought, that we sort of made the films for ourselves. We were the audience, and we were just trying to make things that we thought were entertaining.
And, historically, the paradigm has shifted. So, when during the Jeffrey Katzenberg years, they did hear outside pitches, and they had a whole big development department. When Pixar came in that sort of regime, they didn't hear outside pitches. They were all ideas that were generated in-house. Now, Jen Lee is in charge there, and Clark Spencer. I don't actually know. What we didn't say at the beginning is Ron and I are both retired from Disney. We're not connected to Disney. I don't know their apparatus now, whether or not they're hearing outside pitches or not. It's there's no one right way to do anything. It's really somewhat, the studios, all the studios across town vary, I think, in terms of how they hear pitches. Even, if you, like Sergio pitched Despicable Me, Evil Me was his pitch years ago to Chris Meledandri, I think. And but I couldn't tell you really right now where the studio is at in terms of hearing outside pitches or not.
You guys remember the Gong Show pretty well, right?
We do. The Gong Show was a Paramount that Ron was a big part of pitching ideas for.
I pitched Little Mermaid and Treasure Planet actually at the first Gong Show, the first Disney Gong Show, and they both got gonged. But Mermaid came back because I had written a 2-page treatment on that went more detailed into the possibilities of the story that they liked. Jeffrey and Michael liked, so that got going. John pitched Moana. That was John's idea. He wanted to do something set in the Pacific Islands, and started reading the mythology and got me involved with that. So all the films, and Princess and the Frog actually has a much more elaborate procedure. It actually, both Pixar and Disney for years were developing their own versions of the Frog Prince, the fairy tale, the Frog Prince. All kinds of different versions have been done over the years, and John and I liked that story a lot, and we picked elements from a lot of different versions and then put our spin on it.
Yeah. Speaking of Sergio, you brought Sergio up a minute ago. Did you guys see Klaus?
Yeah.
So, what do you think? What do you both think of Klaus? Do you think the ability to lighten texture can be a game changer in reviving 2D?
Well, I love the look of Klaus and what Sergio did on that, and it really, whether or not it can be a game changer, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it really did give it a look that, took 2D and sort of, almost downplayed the line element and played up the lighting element. And it was beautiful. The art direction of that film, the Polish guy, his name's Szymon, I guess, and then those two dudes are amazing, as is Sergio. So I'm a fan. I don't know if it will change things, but I hope Sergio certainly is going to do another movie, whether that's for Netflix or wherever, another hand-drawn movie, I would hope. I don't know. I was really impressed with it.
I would add, I love Klaus, and I would agree. I also like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I think that suggested new possibilities. For better or worse, with Princess and the Frog, which is it was a decision. It was our decision and John Lasseter's to do that as kind of a retro film, to really try to sort of recapture kind of the magic of old Disney. And everything we did was within that. And I loved that movie. And but at the same time, I think with hand-drawn animation, there is a huge possibilities, as Klaus shows, to reinvent a little bit now. And I think I think there will be now more and more reinventions of hand-drawn. The same technique kind of presented in a way you haven't quite seen before, and I think that's exciting.
I think it was, and I liked, Jeremy Clayton's film, I Lost My Body and things like that, things that take the subject matter and stretch the boundaries and that sort of thing. So it's exciting for me to see things like that. And the challenge on anything is, if you're doing a major enterprise, is getting the financial resources to do it. And I think streaming is helping in that regard, and that, when Disney removed their programming from the other streaming services, that left a hole there, and they're all racing to fill that with animation that they're generating. And I think that's good for the industry.
One more question here from Claresta Muela Corina. What do you guys consider a great story? The ultimate question.
That's a good question.
Ron,
for me, I would say, and I don't know if this applies to animation or any sort of movie. I think a great story to me, there's a way that the plot and the characters unite in a way that the story comes out of the characters and their actions. And if you had totally different characters, you cannot have the same story. I hate it when the plot drives the story in a way that the characters have to do things that seem totally out of character in order to make the story work. But I also don't like it when the characters are really strong, but what they do doesn't build toward a really sort of satisfying climax and finale. I think my basic judgment of a great story, I can't really judge it until the end. When the movie ends, I have this feeling of I saw a great movie, and it may stay with me for the rest of my life, and it just feels satisfying. It feels like I've been through an actual experience that affects me. And if I see a movie that it's like, well, it held my interest for an hour and a half, but I'm never going to give it a second thought, to me that is not a great story.
I'll go with Ron's answer.
It's a good one. So there's a lot of questions on here about how do people get in? What's your advice for students?
Yeah.
So do you have some sort of pithy, we don't have a lot of time left, but some sort of pithy advice for people trying to get into film school, and also out of school, how do they get into the business? What do they do?
I mean, I think you want to develop your skill set, really, obviously. So I still think drawing is a good skill to have, even in the CG world. So I would recommend still trying to get a command of drawing. If you can somehow put your drawings down, your thoughts on paper, and communicate them to people, I think that gives you a tremendous leg up. I think one of the skills that sometimes you have to have that you don't realize is the ability to sort of play well with others, to be collaborative, and to be able to accept constructive criticism. I think sometimes students and younger people, they don't want to show their work, or they don't really want to hear criticism of it sometimes. And they're not just younger people, other people as well. You have to develop enough of a thick skin and objectivity about your own work that you're willing to put it out there, be vulnerable, hear the critique, and step back and try and be unemotional if you can, and then move forward and see how can I make my work better? That's the biggest thing. How look at your own work and try and get objective about it if you can. What is weak in my work? What do I need to do to make it better? There's a tremendous amount of resources nowadays that we didn't even have, but you have all the films you can look at. There are online animation classes and an animation mentor and this and that. Show your work to people, get feedback, and then work hard to improve it. Ron?
I would say that's a great answer. The one thing I would add, to me, I feel like there's so many different areas of animation nowadays. There are so many different jobs. There's storyboarding and visual development, and certainly all that involves great character design and artwork. There's all kinds of technical jobs. There is, I mean, background and layout and cinematography, and there's animation in itself and tech animation. Lighting is such a huge deal. I would suggest certainly getting into things, making films, but trying to figure out if you can, the specific goal, if you feel like this is what I really want to do, this is what I meant to do, and then go after that. But I think if there's just sort of a vague idea that I want to work in the industry, but I'm not quite sure what I want to do, I think it's good to really try to figure that out if you can.
I do think it's true that at Disney, many of the directors came out of, they did storyboarding at one point or another. And within all the disciplines, I certainly do think storyboarding is kind of like directing on paper. You're picking, where the camera is, you're trying to put over acting, you're trying to develop entertainment through a series of things, a sense of pacing, clarity, all those things. So if you're saying, what I really want to do is direct, I think if you come at that through either writing, script writing, or storyboarding, I think those are good avenues. Not that other things can't work. If you're an animator, or if you're an effects artist, or if you're a look person or a lighting person, you may follow that path too. But I do feel like storyboarding is a pretty unique way, and a way of demonstrating that you can tell a story. You can command the attention of an audience and put over ideas clearly and entertainingly and hopefully emotionally.
I'm going to have to.
Yeah, I mean, John.
Go ahead, Ron.
I just add that John and I have the same background, basically, which is we come from animation and story, and I think for directing, that's not the only path to directing, but animation and story is a pretty good path.
Right. And both of you guys didn't make it your first time through, and in your stories, you tried a couple of times before you finally found a way to improve your artwork. So I that's probably wise too. You don't win every time, sometimes.
You have to be able to pick yourself up and keep moving and keep a long distance view on things. And you'll have setbacks along the way. And there were times at Disney where I was ready to quit. I was just very frustrated by things. And you weather certain things and you find, people that are like-minded or that can help you. But yes, you have to be able to handle setbacks and keep moving.
Perseverance, I guess.
Perseverance, actually. Stick to
this is the last question, and I get to ask it. What are you doing now? Now that you're retired from Disney, besides sleeping late and walking around in pajamas all day, what are you doing now?
Well, in my case, of course, I have 2 grandkids now, so I'm babysitting twice a week. Lucy and Gwen, one is 3 and one is 1, and they're great fun, even in this horrible pandemic time. Originally, my son was keeping them away from us, and then it just got so that he needed some help. And so that's great fun. But I am actually animating. I'm doing for years, I wanted to animate my own short. When I began at Disney, I was an animator. I moved into writing and directing and producing and all that. But I still draw, I do caricatures, but I wanted to animate my own film in its entirety. So that's what I'm doing. I'm doing a 3.5-minute film in TV Paint, free plug for TV Paint, French program. And I'm doing it by hand, but I'm doing it on the Cintiq, and I'm having a lot of fun doing it. And I'm about halfway through the animation at this point, and I can't talk about the content because I don't want to do that until I'm closer to the finish line. But it's been great fun for me, and I've got as much creative freedom as I had at Disney. I got no bosses. I got nobody to blame. It's me, and I'm having a great time doing it. So that's me.
Ron?
And I've been working on a book, a sort of retrospective book about the 45 years that I spent at Disney. And the writing is pretty much complete on the book. There's still visual things that are going on. I think the release of the book is still a little ways off, so I can't speak too much about it. But it's been fun. It's been fun looking back.
Does John show up in the book at all?
I know. I'm not in the book. I don't get it.
A little bit.
Well, I'm gonna wrap this now. I want to thank you, but before I want to thank Annecy, of course, and I know who was helping us out, Sue Shakespeare, and behind the scenes Leslie Eza, my coordinator, and then especially you guys, John Musker, Ron Clements. Thank you both very much. This was terrific. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Arno, for hosting us and having us on this thing. And I hope
it was fun.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was it was an honor to have you both for us with this very, very special year. And now, John, I know you are doing an animation film, so you have to, you have to come back to Annecy, and you run the same. You have to come back for a signature session.
I would love to show it at Annecy. Of course, it has to be accepted and all that, but nothing would please me more than bringing it to Annecy. So if I'm continuing to move along, and once I get it near the finish line, I will be talking to you guys and seeing if somehow I can force my way in there and show it. It's a cartoon. What can I tell you? It's a cartoon. Okay.